One of the most common and often questions I get asked while I'm streaming or in any of my comments is how are you possibly resetting your cooldowns as fast as you are? Something that either a majority of new players, people new to the Necromancer, or just in general people who are not necessarily accustomed to being able to reset their cooldowns as fast as we're able to nowadays are constantly having some either issue with or confusion with. So what I want to do is put together a video that is just the 4 best tips and tricks for you to understand how to manage cooldowns in Diablo 4 in general, with some specializations for the Necromancer, of course, but I promise a ton of this information is all class agnostic. You don't have to be a Necro main to be able to get a huge amount of value out of this video. And I figured I'd actually just start with tip number 4 right off the top, and that's just straight up cheating. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to cast Soul Rift. It's a 50-second cooldown skill, and then I'm going to attempt my best to be able to reset that cooldown as fast as possible. I'll have a timer up in the top left, start that timer, see how long it takes me to do this. So here we go, we're in game. And start my timer, and then I'll just go ahead and pause the timer once we're 3.39 seconds. My ult is still going. In 3.39 seconds, I can teach you how on any Necromancer build that you're currently playing, the best ways to be able to automatically reset your cooldowns so you can have 100% uptime on your ultimate of choice. Let's go ahead and get into it. And so that this idea will just be easier to visualize, I went and made a quick little infographic to give you an idea of what it really means to reset a cooldown. Because in Diablo 4, while a skill has a cooldown, the skill will also have a duration, it will have impact, it will have effects in the game. So when we consider how to manage our cooldowns and how to break them down as fast as possible, we have to consider it as like one big overarching system, one big pie that we have to chip away at, made up of a bunch of little smaller subsystems that all have different amounts of impact, and the more that you get of one, the less that you need of another. We just have to chip away at this 50-second cooldown, and we're going to use everything at our disposal. To that end, we're going to use 4 distinct systems. I'm just going to break down very quickly so you understand how they work. These are going to include Cooldown Reduction, a stat in the game, Skill Duration, a really cool temper that was added to the game, Decrepify procs. Now, while this is something specific to the Necromancer, I also have class agnostic options for you as well that I'm going to go over, so don't feel like you're going to miss out on anything. And then tip number 4 obviously is just cheating, but I promise that cheating actually has a bunch of mechanics to it, and I'm not talking about exploits. I'm mostly just talking about things that shouldn't work this way, but I don't want to put the cart before the horse here. We'll get to that near the end. But when we think about each individual piece here, what we need to do is understand how they all work together and how they get us back to this idea of a 50-second cooldown and how we need to manage it. Starting off with tip number 1 is managing your cooldown reduction. Now, this is just straight up a stat in the game, as well as more niche stats available in tempers. But it's understanding how this stat works with other sources of the same stat that'll make this a lot more clear for you. Now, cooldown reduction is a stat that comes in many forms, but the 2 that we're going to be looking at today is the actual affix cooldown reduction. This is available on a small amount of gear pieces. It can be on an offhand for the Necromancer, on the amulet, as well as on a helmet. And then there is specifically the temper ultimate cooldown reduction. This stat will work in concert with normal cooldown reduction, and while they will apply to different things where cooldown works for everything, this obviously only works for ultimate skills, they all go into the same bucket. What's really important to understand about that bucket is that it has a maximum cap. You can only ever reduce a skill's total cooldown by up to 75%. The second thing that you need to understand about this, though, is that these numbers don't get added up together. It's not 13.1 plus 11.7 equals 24.8. They are reverse multiplicative with one another. So if you see here, I have Soul Rift. Soul Rift has a total of 50-second cooldown. So if I were to add on 12.8% cooldown reduction, what do I expect the final number to look like? The way that we get there is we take our 100, that's our 100% of the total duration, minus our 12.8. We get 87.2. Now this is the percentage of the time left over. What I mean by that is we would take our total duration, 50 seconds, we would multiply that by 0.872. Because we want to know what 87.2% of 50 is. That gets us down to 43.6. And if I were to go look in game, you'll notice that our cooldown is at a whopping 43.62. Now, here's a little thing to understand here. The stats that we see in game aren't actually like their full integer or even full decimal values. They're actually rounding. So it looks like I actually have probably like a 12.76 amount of cooldown reduction or something here, and it just rounds up. That's going to make these numbers look a little bit wonky because I have to take what it's showing me as opposed to what the actual number is, because it doesn't show me what the actual number is. But that's how we get to 43.6, and that's why in-game I have 43.62 on my current cooldown. Now, here's a great question for you. If I now add on another 13.1% cooldown reduction for my ultimate skill, what number do we expect it to get to? Well, first off, again, we have to figure out what percentage is being left over, right? So I have 13.1. So I take my 100 minus my 13.1. I'm being left over with 86.9%. Now, that isn't 86.9% of the total amount. It's the 86.9% of the remainder amount. So 43.6, which was what our remainder was, is actually 43.62. Multiplied by 86.9% brings us down to 37.9 seconds. Now let's go ahead and see if that matches up with what's in game. 37.9. And we have 37.93. So again, slight differences in integers here. It's not showing me like the full floating decimal points. But there we go. So rather than reducing it by some kind of additive total amount, we're getting this reverse multiplication. Then adding on our last bit here, 11.7, we can just do that math very quickly. 100 minus our 11.7 means that we should have a remainder of 88.3% of the amount that we had before. So 37.90578 multiplied by 0.883, 88.3%, and we should be somewhere down near 33.47 seconds. And we're at 33.49 seconds, again, with rounding errors. So when we're talking about cooldown reduction, the important things to remember is that it's reverse multiplicative, so you can't just add them together. You have to reduce the remainder by how much of a percentage it gets reduced by. And then all of this will act on your cooldown in total in steps. It'll take the first amount and then multiply that by 1 minus the second amount, then multiply it by 1 minus the third amount, so on and so forth. You can never exceed 75% total reduction. So considering this is a 50-second skill, we can never reduce it by more than 75%. That means it would leave over 25% of its total. The lowest we could get the cooldown of Soul Rift naturally, just clicking the skill and watching it go, would be 12.5 seconds. So now that we're done with cooldown reduction, that part of the pie is now managed. We now just have to handle the remainder of the pie. And the next thing that we're going to be looking at is just skill duration itself. Now, Soul Rift's duration is 8 seconds. And you'll see how we're talking about this pie concept, right? That 8 seconds is already eating into the cooldown that we need to hit, right? If the Soul Rift only lasts for 8 seconds and we could get our cooldown to 8 seconds without having to do anything else, we would already be at 100% uptime. So the way that we can shore up that gap a little bit more is just by adding on skill duration. You'll see that both on my gloves as well as on my boots, I've tempered on Soul Rift duration. This just increases the length of time that Soul Rift lasts for. This can reach a total maximum cap of 100%, so you can only ever double the total duration of a skill, and there's no weird multiplication that you have to do. You take your 33.4% here, you add on your 32.5% here, that gets you up to a whopping 65.9, and that's just how much longer Soul Rift will last for. So I look at my 8 seconds here, I add on about 30%. 30% should be a whopping like 2.4 seconds around there, and we're up to 10.58, 8 plus the 2.5, and then I'm going to toss on another 33%, and we get up to a whopping total of 13.25 seconds. So great. Not only have we already reduced the cooldown from 50 all the way down to 33 seconds, but we've taken our duration from 8 seconds up to 13. What this means is that left over is just 20.24 seconds that are unaccounted for. But you can see by taking the total pie and cutting off these two sections, we've already made it significantly easier to manage this middle part. All right, great. We are basically halfway done with it. It was started at 50. We only need to cut off 20 more seconds. The next thing that we're going to be using is Decrepify procs. Now, I'm going to talk about the non-Necromancer specific options here first, just so again, people who aren't super Necro nerds can walk away with something here. But what I'm talking about from Decrepify is the Lucky Hit ability that has a 15% chance of triggering that will reduce all of your active cooldowns by 1 second. Now, luckily in the expansion, they've added in 2 different rune words that can both act on all of our cooldowns, but more specifically our ultimate skill cooldowns. The Aeon rune will reduce all of your active cooldowns by 0.1 seconds. It only requires 100 offering to be able to trigger it. And what this means basically is that if you were to put this onto an automatic system, either running the whenever you use a core skill, or maybe even just the when you are standing still for 0.3 seconds, you will naturally be reducing the cooldowns of all of the skills. And the great part about it is that it works for everything. So it would work for my Corpse Tendrils and my Soul Rift and my Blood Mist. even if they were all on cooldown simultaneously. Now, I personally find AOM to just not be strong enough. The major issue here is that it's a very fine line. If you were to bump this up to like 0.5 seconds, that would actually be kind of heinous. Down at 0.1 seconds, it kind of feels a little bit too weak. This will probably continue to be changed and balanced as the game goes forward, but there's a significantly stronger option. The Zek rune, on the other hand, requires 200 offering, but it will reduce your active cooldown by 2 seconds every single time that it triggers. I'm going to use Lith. This is going to generate a 25 offering every 0.3 seconds while I'm just standing still. I'm going to go ahead and toss in Zek here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cast my Soul Rift, and I'm just going to spam Corpse Explosion because I need to be in combat for this to trigger. And you'll notice that every time that my buff goes up, this gets reduced by 2 seconds. So boom, we drop down to 16 from 18, and here we go, dropping down to 11. So this is obviously a class agnostic, but typically very powerful option available for the majority of people for being able to reduce your ultimate cooldown. Now, what this is effectively performing the function of is what the Necromancer can already do nearly naturally with the use of Abhorrent Decrepify. And I'm just going to very quickly show you that thing happening, and then I'm going to break down the math of it. This is probably going to be one of the lengthier parts of the video, but I promise you there's something that you're going to learn here that you may have not fully understood, or maybe just kind of accepted that this is how it worked. And I think it would be worth your time to check it out. I'll make it as fast as possible. So if Abhorrent Decrepify says Lucky Hit chance 15% of the time, you will reduce your active cooldowns whenever an enemy is hit while afflicted with Decrepify. How often do we think that this will proc? Well, the number's right there, Mac, right? 15% of the time. But that's not exactly how Lucky Hit chance works. It's significantly more convoluted than that, but I'm going to give you the brass tacks. I'm also going to include a link down below to the resource on Maxroll breaking down how Lucky Hit chance works. And while I promise you would walk away completely competent, be able to make informed decisions from this video, I think going and reading that article on Maxroll by the amazing Ava is going to help to cement a lot of weird nuances and better explain why sometimes you don't get the outcome that you were expecting, even though as far as you could tell it should work. But the layman's term breakdown of how Lucky Hit chance works, as long as you have advanced tooltips on, you can see the Lucky Hit chance of your skill. Only skills can have Lucky Hit chance coefficients, meaning a chance to proc something. And only skills that specifically have a Lucky Hit chance can work in this way. Whenever a skill deals damage to a target, so Bloodlance whenever I successfully cast Bloodlance, or a Bloodlance fires out from one of my effects, or my Bloodlance were to pierce through a target and hit another target, every time the skill would deal damage to a target, any number of targets, it has a chance to roll Lucky Hit effects. And we start off with a whopping 50% chance to trigger them. That's actually pretty good. Now, the equation for Lucky Hit chance is also fairly simple. The only issue being that the majority of the tooltips are actually lying to you and giving you averages as opposed to true Lucky Hit chance. But again, read the resource article from Ava. They will go into exceptionally better detail explaining that. But the base equation for anything that is an instance of damage, you just take your chance to proc, so Bloodlance has a 50% chance to proc. We denote that as 0.5. I currently have no Lucky Hit chance bonus, and the effect, the Decrepify effect, will trigger 15% of the time. We denote that with 0.15, and the outcome is a whopping 7% chance. It's kind of wild, but 7% chance for this to trigger. Now, how do we get to that? Well, first off, you take your Lucky Hit chance of the skill itself, multiply by 1 plus your bonus. We don't have any bonus right now, but I'll show you that as well. And you multiply it by the effect. So while at first saying 7.5% chance for this to trigger seems like not a lot, you have to really sit down and ask yourself, right? What is 50% of a 15% chance to proc? Half of the time you'll proc it 15% of the time. That comes out to be a 7.5. When we're talking about statistics, I'm not going to bore you to death here. When I say 7.5% chance, somebody will typically think about this in terms of 100. So they'll say 7.5 times out of 100 I should expect to proc it. That's also not really how statistics work. When you have a percent chance of something, like a 1 in 10, you expect it to happen once in 10 attempts, about 65% of the time. Still quite possible and will happen more often than not, but it's not truly a yes, if I attack 100 times, it will happen 7.5 times. But there is a lot that we can do. We can modify this outcome by adding on a ton of Lucky Hit chance. That's the part that's currently missing. So if I were to put on my Perdition that has 29% Lucky Hit chance, my Offhand which has 10% Lucky Hit chance, and my Starless Skies that has 18% lucky hit chance and go down here, you'll see that I now have a total of 57.1, and I can actually bump that even higher because we can put in some skill points here to precision to gain another 15, and all of a sudden I'm sitting at a whopping 72.1% bonus lucky hit chance. Now, how does that fit into our equation? Looking at the total here, I'm just going to go ahead and add on my lucky hit chance bonus of 72.1%. And that brings our chance to proc from 7.5 up to a whopping 12.9. But I added on 72% lucky hit chance bonus. Why did it work that way? Well, if we go back and we look at our equation, the way that it works is it takes the base skill value, which was 50%, and then multiplies it by 1 plus our bonus. So as opposed to adding 72% like onto your skill, that's not how it works. It instead modifies it. So if I were to tell you we're going to do 50% more damage, you wouldn't just add 50 to it, right? You would multiply it by 1.5 to get to that total bonus. The same thing with lucky hit chance. But that's the impact that lucky hit chance has on this equation. Now, that's not it though. If it was just that, you wouldn't get the type of cooldown that we've been seeing. There are two other things that we can do to modify how often this should be happening. And for us to understand that, we have to go back to this idea of it's an entire system and what it means for it to have a 12% chance to proc in the first place. Well, if you remember, I described lucky hit chance as something that can roll every time a skill were to do damage to any number of targets. And this chance to proc is just for a single blood lance. Now, what can we do to increase how often we're rolling the dice? Well, we can either attack more targets, meaning that there are more instances of it having the opportunity to go off, and we can also just literally attack more often. Let's look at what those two things do to impact how often we're doing this. So in this exact same example, I'm going to be firing off Bloodlance, but into multiple targets. And again, remember, it's anytime Bloodlance would deal damage. So not only when it hits, not only when it pierces through and hits again, but because we have that lanced functionality, whenever one lanced enemy takes damage, all of them take damage. And since it's applying Bloodlance's damage, it can apply to all of the targets. And every instance of damage to every one of those targets. So I'll cast Blood Wave into the back, and I will spam cast my Blood Lance into these targets. And you'll notice that before I've run out of essence, I have completely reset the cooldown on Blood Wave. And that was with nothing else going on. That was just pure lucky hit chance triggering off of multiple targets. So while I have a 12% chance for this to trigger, by the end of my rotation there, everybody was lanced. So every time I cast Blood Lance, every single target was getting hit. So as opposed to one instance of 12.9%, I have 5 instances of 12.9%. What this gives us is the chance or expectation that if I were to do this 5 times simultaneously, the chance of it triggering at least one time all of a sudden skyrockets to an amazing nearly 50% of the time. And that's assuming that we're only attacking once and measuring the output of it. But what about that other part that I said? In light of having more targets, what if I just hit the same target multiple times? On my main set of gear, my character only has a whopping 12.5% increased attack speed. And I'm not going to go into the extremes of attack speed because again, we actually have an attack speed resource on Maxroll as well. I'll also link that below. But what you need to understand is that basically animations in this game, so me casting Blood Lance one time, takes a number of frames. The game runs at 60 frames a second. So to be able to attack faster, but it's not as simple as just take your weapon speed and multiply it by 1 plus your attack speed bonus. There's something called a breakpoint here. We need to be able to reduce the total frames of the animation by 1 for it to actually speed it up. You can't attack in parts of a frame. That doesn't really make sense, right? 1 frame is the smallest unit of time. So attempting to do something in between a smallest unit of time and the next one doesn't really add up. So when we have attack speed on our character, we need to hit certain breakpoints. The more attack speed that we get, the faster that we attack typically. Now, the other thing you need to understand is that attack speed only adds up to a total of 100, but kind of not really. There's actually 2 different caps for attack speed. We colloquially refer to them as cap 1 and cap 2. Cap 1 is all of the normal stats on your gear. So if you were to look at the regular attack speed in blue on my gloves here, that goes into cap 1. Whereas the blood attack speed, as well as this 50% bonus attack speed I'll get from Rathmas Chosen, all go into cap 2. What that means is that at maximum cap, you can actually be at 200% attack speed. Now, your individual skill with your individual weapon combination might not actually get faster between like 180 and 200 attack speed, but unless you're willing to go learn all the breakpoints that, again, we have in our resource guide, basically the more attack speed, the more better, right? So if I were to do this exact same experiment, where I took off all the gear that's giving me attack speed, I cast my Blood Wave, and then I cast my Blood Lance this way, you'll notice that while I am now very slowly ramping up, I didn't come anywhere near being able to reduce the entirety of my cooldown over the length of time that took me before I ran out of essence. Now let's go ahead and put on a metric ton of attack speed to see that difference. So here I have 16.3 attack speed, obviously for my Ring of Starless Skies. Well, it's also going to give me Lucky Hit chance, gives me a whopping 30% attack speed. My other ring has another 16% attack speed. And then my regular gloves, like I was showing you previously, has attack speed, blood attack speed, and Wrath Mist Chosen. So putting all of these things on, and if I were to remember exactly, I think I'm now at the 17 frame breakpoint, meaning that I'm attacking more than 3 times per second. Do the exact same thing, and then spam off all my blood lances, and the rate at which we're able to proliferate our blood lances, meaning more targets are being hit, and the rate at which that we were able to then reduce our cooldown was significantly faster. So whereas thinking about it as more targets equals more opportunities to trigger, we can do this same equation with more attacks per second is more opportunities to trigger. If we were to think about this chance to proc in a matter of procs per second, this assumed that we only attacked once per second. So we had a 12.91% chance of being able to trigger it. But if we're attacking greater than 3 times per second, we'll just round it down to 3. And basically we can do the same equation that we did here, except that we will take it as if it had 3 opportunities to succeed, meaning that we have to take the inverse of 3 opportunities of it failing. So I do the exact same thing here, except I'm going to bring this up to the power of 3. And what we're left with is an expectation that once per second, we will proc Lucky Hit chance about 34% of the time, or about a third of the time, meaning that any given second to second, we would expect to trigger it at least once every 3 seconds. And then obviously that compounds when we also add on the additional targets that we're expecting to see this over. Don't you love it when you come up with a visual medium and like it actually properly represented what you were hoping to show? I didn't know how well this was going to go over. I don't really script anything or plan it out, but I'm glad it looks like this. We were left over with a measly 15 seconds left on our cooldown that we needed to manage some way. We increased our Lucky Hit chance, we got Cooldown Reduction, we got Soul Rift duration, we increased our attack speed to be able to trigger multiple procs per second, but we still weren't able to get there. And again, that's where cheating comes in. And I promise you, this isn't an exploit. This is just how the game works. The issue lies in abhorrent Decrepify. Do you remember what I told you about it? Lucky Hit chance effects are only supposed to be able to be triggered by skills with Lucky Hit chance. On top of that, historically, skills which did not have a Lucky Hit chance or effects that don't have a Lucky Hit chance were able to proc abhorrent Decrepify in the past. If you play minion Necromancer, you'll know that your minions proc abhorrent Decrepify. They don't proc Lucky Hit chance, they just proc this right here. But they have added something new to the game, something that you can't really not use because it's integral to the power system now. And it's called your mercenaries. So I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I'm going to cast Blood Wave in the opposite direction so it doesn't hit these targets. My Cursed Aura will continuously apply my Decrepify here. Let's just see how long this cooldown takes. It has a cooldown of 33.49 seconds. There we go, I've cast it. And we'll just wait for Subo to do some of his cool attacks, like throw out that Molotov cocktail. And all of a sudden, you notice that the cooldown on my skill starts reducing pretty drastically. It's almost like it's synced up with when Subo attacks these targets and when he applies his AoE damage. Oddly enough, that wasn't a total of 33.49 seconds. It was more like 20 seconds. Your mercenaries can trigger abhorrent Decrepify, but it's your reinforcement as well. So I'll go ahead and cast my Blood Wave, and then I'm just going to go ahead and cast Blight, which will summon my little Aldkin, and then Aldkin will drop his huge Fire Nova. You'll notice that the cooldown on our skills started dropping precipitously fast. For whatever reason, your mercenaries proc abhorrent Decrepify. And the cool part about it is it starts to double dip on some of these things that I described earlier for being able to manage our own Lucky Hit chance and our own ability to proc this, namely from the addition of attack speed. But while our cooldown reduction won't increase how often they use their effects, and our Lucky Hit chance is not inherited by them in any way that I can discern mathematically in game, their ability to deal damage to targets who are cursed absolutely does apply abhorrent Decrepify procs. And on top of that, your attack speed increases their attack speed. So if you're to look at how fast Subo is currently attacking, I'm then going to proc an Overpower, which will gain me 50% attack speed. And let's just go ahead and watch his attack speed go up. And all of a sudden, he is now attacking significantly faster. And you'll notice that when it runs out, his attack speed will go down as well. So what this means is that on top of our cooldown reduction from our stats, our duration from our stats, our own lucky hit chance, our lucky hit chance bonus, increasing our attacks per second, increasing the number of targets being hit by it. We can also rely on our mercenaries to not only proc it themselves, but also benefit from our attack speed to further increase their efficiency of doing it as well. What this means is that when put all together, we should, against a single target with our Soul Rift, and by triggering our Aldkin as well as our Subo, be able to fully reduce the cooldown of this skill before the duration of it were to run out or come exceptionally close. Let's just look, and we are immediately infinite. We are recasting Soul Rift at the same rate that its cooldown is being reduced by the combination of our skills, our reinforcement, and our mercenary applying their own lucky hit chance to trigger Abhorrent Decrepify as well. There you go. It's as simple as that. You just gotta cheat. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that this went a long way to clear up any confusion, shore up any holes in the knowledge that you have, or just grant you entirely new knowledge so you can go better handle the game, enjoy the challenge, and be able to theorycraft your build that much more finely now that you better understand these systems. If you haven't already, leave a like on the video. I'd love it dearly. It helps me out so much. And on top of that, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, different ideas, cool things that you've seen recently, let me know down in the comments. I spend way too much time in my comment section, and at some point I'll start to worry about what type of impact that'll have on my mental health. But at least for right now, I'm just glad that I get to be able to answer questions for you all down there, be able to guide you towards better information if I don't have it personally available. But again, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.